Well, good evening. I wish I could be with you tonight. Unfortunately, I'm going to be in New Hampshire on a sea level rise conference where I'll be a speaker. So I did want to be able to participate one way or another, and so we'll do it by video. I think the directorio has done a wonderful job over these last 25 years supporting the cause of Cuba, freedom and democracy. And so it's a pleasure to be here, even if it's virtual.
Ambassador Cason, what does it mean to you to invest in Cuba?
Well, first of all, if we're talking about investors, is it a smart thing for them to invest in Cuba? I think there's a lot of hype out there today about the ability to go into Cuba and make money, which is, I know there's a lot of business people that are salivating about the supposed amounts of money they can make in Cuba. I think it's extremely risky for a lot of reasons. One, as we know, almost all businesses in Cuba are owned by the Cuban military. There are no rules of the game that are enforceable in international courts. Their local laws in terms of business are very weak, so there's really no guarantee. And we've seen so many of these business people, foreign business people, that have come in and thought that they were dealing with a partner that was trustworthy and ended up in jail when the Cubans decided they wanted to take over the property. And as you know, if you're an investor in Cuba, there's tremendous corruption, and so you have to do some things under the table, and then when they decide that it's time for you to go, they'll use that, put you in jail, and confiscate your investments. The key thing to remember is that GDP is consumption plus investment and government. In Cuba, there's really no investment on the part of the Cuban government. There's no consumption because the average income is around $24. So, and this is after 55 years of Europeans and other people coming into Cuba, investing, sending tourists, trading, and with the thought that the money would trickle down and would help promote democracy. Well, 55 years later, the average income is $24. It all goes to the military, which controls everything that's important in Cuba. So what you're doing when you invest in Cuba is you're supporting the military. It's not going to trickle down. There really are not many entrepreneurs in Cuba. There are people that have specific licenses to run, fill up cigarette lighters and those sorts of things. But we've seen, and when I was in Cuba, that they can take that away at any time. And when things improve, they tend to take away those licenses because they really don't believe in free enterprise. They certainly don't believe in capitalism. And when they allow those licenses, it's for the moment until they can find a new sugar daddy that will come in and allow them to get away from that sort of release valve that they've been forced to grant at certain moments in time.
And what are the human rights implications for investing in Cuba?
Well, if you remember that the Cuban military runs lots and lots of organizations to spy on Cuban people, to put down dissent, to spy on each other, to make sure that there's no change that occurs that Fidel and Raul and the cupola want to occur. So the idea that investing is going to somehow improve the lot of Cubans or improve human rights, I think is ridiculous. I don't think there's any case, if you look around the world, where investment has improved to human rights. Human rights are going to be improved when the Cuban government adopts an economic model that allows for greater freedom, and when they change the economic model. Right now, they firmly believe, and they've told us, he said to President Obama, read my lips, we are not changing our economic system or our political system because of having diplomatic relations with you. So I don't see how American tourists going to Cuba, eventually if American investment's allowed, why the results would be any different than the results we've seen from the democratic Europeans doing it. There have been no human rights improvements. In fact, they're worse now today, the situation, than they were when I was there. So I don't see the linkage between economic activity and improvement in human rights in Cuba because it's a regime that basically has said we do not have a legitimate opposition. Therefore, we are not going to, and we don't have human rights violations. They say you do. So with that kind of a in quotes, partner, unquote, we're not going to be able to improve human rights through dialogue, and certainly not through sending tourists. In fact, the other way around, the money that goes there goes to the military, and they can afford more police, more tear gas, more batons, whatever they need to put down the opposition, which basically believes that we've abandoned them, and I think they're right.
And how does investment also impact the prospects, or what are the implications for a democratic transition in Cuba?
The only way we're going to have a democratic transition in Cuba is if there's a mechanism by which the Cuban people can participate in a discussion of their future. The Cubans used to call it the battle of ideas when I was in Cuba. Of course, they only wanted to have their army on the battlefield, and if the opposition, the dissidents, tried to participate in a discussion like the Varela Project and many others about the future of Cuba, they were beaten, arrested, given 25-year jail sentences. So there are no mechanisms through which the average Cuban can influence their government. That basically has said, and has put in the Constitution, that socialism forever, it can't be changed. So I think they want democracy in general. They want more economic opportunities. They would like to move on to a different system, but how can they influence a government that has basically said, we are not going to change, we are perfect, we're going to perfeccionar socialismo. So I don't see, until the government itself changes, and I believe when the Castros are gone, then a real discussion can take place as to whether or not the military, which will be and continue to be the governing power, has decided that with those two anchors for change gone, whether they'll be, it's in their interest to accommodate the Cuban people for more freedom and democracy. Right now, it's not going to happen, and certainly not because we have democratic relations or send bathing suit tourists or so-called principal tourism to Cuba.
And what are the implications of investing in Cuba on U.S. national security and national security interests?
Well, I think we have to look at, what kind of a regime do we think the Cubans are? The administration seems to think that they are partners with which we can engage, and if we just talk long enough and send them tourists, send them investment, give them credit, which is what the Cubans really want, that somehow they'll change their behavior. But in general, people that are in the 80s never change. It doesn't matter whether they're rightist or leftist, they're not going to change. The Cuban leadership has said to us, we are not changing just because you are so desperate to have diplomatic relations. They're certainly not going to have normalization, because that would mean recognizing they have an opposition and allowing us to do things that we normally do around the world as diplomats. No, I don't think that they are going to change. They want to change. They feel they need to change, because the more we send money their way, the less incentive is for them to change. That's why they're cracking down on dissidents. And the other thing is, when we had sort of the second phase of the U.S. embargo, the idea was it would keep money out of the hands of the Cubans when they were in their internationalist phase. We'll have to see in the next couple of weeks whether the stories of Cuban troops going to Syria manning Russian tanks is true. I wouldn't put it past them. They've done it so many times. But if you look around, Cuba has not changed its behavior because of anything we've done. They were caught red-handed sending weapons to North Korea. They have the suspicious case of ammunition and explosives coming in to Cuba through Colombia under sacks of rice and sugar. Where were those going? They've reopened the Lourdes intercept facility to listen to U.S. communications up and down the East Coast. They've allowed Russian spy ships to come in. They're sending high-level people to Syria, to Iran. So again, they've shown they are not our friends. And we have to remember back when Fidel took over, he said, a revolution needs an enemy, and the U.S. is going to be our enemy. And they've shown consistently, no matter what we do, a president extends a hand of what we think is friendship, and they'll bat it away and do something like in Angola, or like a shoot down of the Brothers of the Rescue, to put a stop to it, because they need an enemy to blame the failures of their regime. So I think nothing good will come out of this in terms of U.S. national security. Maybe that the money that we're sending will end up enabling them to do more things around the world in their so-called international guise that is exactly detrimental to our national interest.
Ambassador Cason, any final thoughts?
Normalization, don't expect it. Don't expect, if you're a businessman, that you're going to make a lot of money in Cuba. There's no money to buy. You're not going to sell your chewing gum because the Cubans don't even have eggs. Cubans still want to get out of the island. We're going to see more immigration out. And I think that the president has been very naive, and I think this is going to hurt the cause of democracy in Cuba by giving more resources to the Cubans to continue the repression. And I expect that we're going to be very disillusioned and frustrated at the process of normalization, because I doubt that in the next 10 years we're going to get anywhere near normal relations with an abnormal country that is the pariah in Latin America in terms of democracy. Just not going to happen. So don't hold your breath.